So 20 years ago, almost exactly 20 years ago, though I think it was in November, early November, our, I don't know, godfather, can I say godfather, Adam Michnik, gave a lecture at the New School, which was entitled Virus Montesinos. Here is the first paragraph from that lecture. I translated, so I have it, I have all rights to it. I call it virus, I call it Montesinos virus, a newly discovered cancerous disease found most commonly in contemporary democratic states. It is almost identical with the Milosevic virus, to which young post-communist democracies seemed particularly vulnerable. Let me explain what I mean. And then he went on and he indeed explained what he meant. I don't know whether you know who Montesinos was, because it was already 20 years ago. So Vladimiro Lenin Ilyich Montesinos Torres is a former long-standing head of Peru, Peru's secret police, so I should say actually intelligence service, who served under President Fujimori and who bribed heavily parliamentarians, the members of the opposition, to leave their party and to join the Fujimori's camp, political camp. And the transactions were videotaped, and as a result, Fujimori had to resign, and Vladi Montesinos had to flee the country. Michnik argued, and this is the last sentence I'm taking from him, is that he was not just the head of the political police, but he was a head of political criminal mafia that included generals and ministers, parliamentarians, prosecutors, and judges. The virus we are dealing today with is not a Montesinos virus, and actually it's not a figure of speech anymore. Because that virus revealed some features of so-called liberal democracy which went unnoticed. Nevertheless, as you already have mentioned in in those earlier discussions, that stuff that was revealed, actually fairly broad issues, set of issues emerged, or at least for me. New, most of them new. Not only those which appear to strengthen the authoritarian movements and institutions, but also really new, although old. One of them is mentioned is discussed in Gábor's paper, and I'm going to ask Gábor to talk about it. He called it, I don't know, not everybody probably read every paper, embourgeoisement. And bourgeoisement, the issue of, so that's one of the issues I want us to talk about. A reintroduction of the old into the new in the times of pandemic, meaning in the times of sharp economic crisis and unemployment and inflation and the incredible impoverishment. So it's an economic response, a response to pandemic. And this is what I like to talk about first, like us to talk about first. Many of you have mentioned already, particularly the different aspects of that response. But what strikes me is not what, and we actually, those papers helped me to think about it, although very early on when we did the letters from Pandemos, the letters from the field, it's a series of articles that we have, or columns that we have published on our website, this website. There was an author who wrote from Wrocław, from Poland, in a short piece. I didn't take it so seriously then yet. It was very early on, which is called Poland in the Shadow of Marx and Virus and Pandemos. And he was talking about it, how the virus and the politics around the virus and social relations around the virus have revealed a new set of divisions. And in fact, he was talking about a re-emergence of three new social groupings, perhaps even social classes. So the class interest as something which drives or which kind of re-emerged from the past and was reinserted in the present. So I'm going to stop right now. I hope you can join in with, there are various things that could be brought into this basket. Hungary itself, it's been well described as a mafia state, although it's not, the earlier book was not about, on mafia state, it was about Russia, not about Hungary. So what I like, the question I like to ask, what do you think about this phenomenon of embourgeoisement? Something that indeed dramatically comes to the surface with the pandemic, but is it everywhere coming to the surface? And if so, does it have a potential to bring about the kind of unintended consequences, that is to undermine the push towards de-democratization? So this is the first question I would like to talk about. The second question is a question of autocratic legalism. And then finally, the question, and I do hope, Jeff already suggested it, that some of those things that you are not able to talk about while discussing the kind of gap between a utopia of that's really not utopia, but the local self-governments, which really represent civic and citizens' power, and completely deaf and politically self-isolating or isolating, whatever, central government. Some of those issues could be brought in here, particularly that in the third question that I will ask is about the question of which has to do something with the paper that done by the paper on Slovakia by Alexandra Bitušíková, which has to do with the possibilities of opening or closing the spaces, opening bigger spaces for far right and extreme right, alt-right, but perhaps opening also. Okay, so here we are. We'll start with Gábor, if I may, and so this is a slightly different take on what we've been discussing, but it has incredible impact on politics and on the life of everyday life of everybody around. So your paper was broad and embraced some of those things. I'd like you just to perhaps, yes, keep. If you want, you can make key points, but I'd like you to address the question of that you brought in, and later on, our Turkish colleague will be able to actually add something fairly specific study he's done on the situation of banks and or the contribution of banks and corporations to that new situation of reintroduction of bourgeoisie or renewal of bourgeoisie. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. And you referring to Alberto Fujimori is also a very good way of introducing basically my main argument, which you could think is of as a somewhat controversial argument, in the sense that it highlights a different side of populism. So Fujimori was the first wave of populists that differed from previous waves of populists in Latin America, in a sense that he was rather a kind of neoliberal type of populist, as opposed to previous import substitution, more kind of left radical populists. And what we see in Hungary is, I think, more resembling the Fujimori type of populism than previous types of left-wing populisms in Latin America. And I think, so to jump ahead, what I'm making, the main argument that I'm making in my paper is that we need to rethink the way we frame and think about populism itself. So we tend to think about populism in terms of policy failure, in terms of its dysfunctionality, that it's driven by the whims of the populists in power, that it's against good governance, that it's against evidence-based policy making, and that it's driven by an intention to exclude cultural outgroups, right? By this tension between cosmopolitans and rooted nationalists. And this is definitely part of the reality, but this way of narrating populism misses the other element, the political economic element. And if you look at populist health crisis management in Hungary from the political economic perspective, I think a lot of controversial measures make more sense than trying to explain it as irrational or dysfunctional. So we've talked about different elements of populist health crisis management in Hungary. What I like to highlight is that there are indeed certain steps that you could argue fall into the dominant paradigm of analyzing populism, focusing on dysfunctionality and culture and populist agency, like, for example, the centralization of the flow of information, or the introduction of military leadership in hospitals or care homes, or banning migrants from the southern borders, or banning Iranian students, or the recent move to ban people from legally changing gender. These can be all framed in a framework of populist culture and agency. But then the other policies that fall into either the epidemic responses of the crisis or socioeconomic responses of the crisis, I think reveal the underlying political economic logic of Orbán, which has been unfolding over the past 10 years. And in my research, I've been showing that this is actually a new type of managing market economy at Europe's semi-periphery, moving away from a previous model heavily reliant on foreign investment and trying to pacify people through sort of embedding neoliberalism. This is a new, more authoritarian type of capitalism, targeting what you call embourgeoisement of the upper middle class, redistributing money towards high-income groups, and supporting national capitalists, but also supporting transnational capitalists in the productive sectors. And there is a host of economic policies introduced that target these sectors. And the way the Hungarian government was addressing the health crisis was following this logic. So, for example, one of the first steps they took was basically suspending the labor code, which allows companies to diverge from regulations with regard to work time, but also with regard to the minimum income, and completely flexibilizing labor relations. The other controversial measure was basically only introducing economic policy measures only targeting businesses, but not really introducing any new social policy measures targeting newly unemployed people. And when you consider the extreme withdrawal of funds from social policy regimes in Hungary, a massive reduction on social policy spending, and that Hungary has had only a 3 months unemployment benefit on offer for unemployed people, this really is a very harsh austerity regime imposed in times of austerity. But I don't think that this is irrational. I don't think that this is dysfunctional. I think this is particularly following this type of authoritarian capitalist logic that Orbán was following over the past 10 years. And I see the steps, as Christoph has also mentioned, to curtail democracy as necessary steps towards stabilizing rule, because these are all rather unpopular measures. And you might heard also that there was a highly controversial measure to reduce, to send home basically ill people from hospitals and free up 60% of hospital beds in Hungary, which doesn't make sense at all from an epidemic perspective. There's no way there's that amount of infected people would arrive in Hungary. But it makes sense from the long-term perspective. The government has been reducing healthcare spending, and it has attempted to reduce the number of hospital beds, which is a very unpopular step again. And the government is using the corona crisis to push through with these measures. And of course, you need to curtail democracy, both at the local level, which is the last bastion for the opposition in Hungary that could capitalize on social disillusionment, but also at the national level, right? It's not just about the introduction of rule by decree, which will be phased out in June, but also cuts to the funding of opposition parties, which is extremely important for the opposition parties' ability to organize resentment, but also like the steps to criminalize basically criticizing the government. And there have been already people detained for simply criticizing the government on Facebook. So these are measures that will have a long-term impact on democracy, in addition to cuts to local governments, that I think serve the purpose to bolster power and allow Orban to continue Orbanomics, which is basically a tool to redistribute money to high-income groups and national capitalists and also transnational, multinational companies in the productive sectors.
Thank you very much, Gábor. So we will come back at some point fairly soon, because we will be talking also about the governance by decree and by regulations, which are kind of issued independently from the legal framework and on the new laws introduced at that time. So please keep it in mind. And thank you. And what I'd like to do now is to move to Ali, who is going, Ali Riza Güngen, our colleague from Turkey, who I hope would help us to understand these that factor that we are talking about, the factor of furthering the de-democratization in the time of pandemic by employing, using, resorting to the support, to the help of institutions, financial institutions.
Yes, thanks a lot. Let me start by saying that I was really happy to read Gábor's piece because Erdoganomics resemble a lot to Orbanomics. So it was really nice to see the similarities in terms of intervention, in terms of, but of course there are some differences. And hopefully we can discuss this a bit further. But I'd like to emphasize that, when we look at the Turkish case, it is striking that it is one of the weakest points of the Erdogan regime in economic terms. You can talk of the reserves of the central bank. Literally, Turkey ran out of reserves by mid-March. If you, exclude the borrowed US dollars, there is no money at the central bank. And if you look at the public expenditure, it is really hard to talk about, sustaining a high level of public expenditure to cope with the crisis. Mm-hmm. So it is one of the weakest points of Erdogan regime, and it shows itself in the stimulus package and the relief and stimulus package targeting pandemic, the collapse associated with pandemics. So almost 3% of the stimulus goes directly to the households and the working classes. And aside from that, all of the regulations, all of the intervention is pretty much directed to support the small and medium economic enterprises and the corporations that are having a hard time in rolling over their debt. So when you look at the picture, you would see that, we should emphasize the weakness of the regime, weakness of the authoritarianism in coping with the economic collapse. But what I wanted to do in the piece was that showing, there are some opportunities for the authoritarian regime, and there are some mechanisms that they can resort to. And public banks is one of them. Public banks is probably the most important element in coping with the crisis for the Erdogan regime right now. So on the one hand, we see that they are in a way, of course, resorting to this old repertoire, for example, Nazan was talking about. They are increasing the cost of non-obedience, and they are always after some invisible enemies. But when you look at the economic intervention, you would see that also there was a kind of accumulation of, accumulation of knowledge regarding crisis management. So they pretty much used the public banks to transfer the risks of corporations and households to the future. So it was really effective. So income support given by the Turkish authorities is really, is minuscule and cannot help to the households, but we can see a much higher amount of credit expended to the households by using public banks. So by way of socializing the financial risks of corporations using public banks, and by way of expanding new credit to households, they in a way managed to minimize or lessen the impact of the first couple of months, the collapse that we have seen in the first couple of months of the pandemic. So we might have the highest unemployment rate in Turkey right now. Probably April will be the highest unemployment rate in the history of the country. But thanks to these...
Which is what the percent? What is the percentage right now? Unemployment?
The April figures will be explained, will be declared in July, but I mean, by looking at the estimates and layoffs, we can say that the official unemployment rate will be 20%. But of course, if you add the ones that benefit from short-term allowance and the other sectors, you would see that the unemployment rate will be around 30%. So the official figure will be 20%, but yeah, so, I mean, this crisis itself came on top of the 2018-19 crisis of Turkey. But I mean, they were able to cope with similar crises before. Throughout the recent global financial cycles, each time Turkey faced an economic collapse, they used public banks to renew credit expansion and to socialize the risks of corporations and to, in a way, give a chance to households to roll over their debt and to, in a way, buy some time. So I wanted to emphasize that point in the piece. So even if we are talking about the weakness of the authoritarian regime, we should also be considering the authoritarian crisis management that took shape in the last couple of decades. And Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party is like mastering the art of crisis management. And this is probably their biggest strength right now.
Thank you. Thank you. So when things come up, you can please jump in in the course of the discussion. What I like to switch now to, it's not so far, is to actually do a conversation that some of the elements already appeared before, which has to do with law. Not just the politics around the elections that that either had happened or are happening, and we know are to happen, but with a larger problem of an issue of what is being called autocratic legalism, of those of the non-democratic or strongly illiberal regimes which are using the law and the instruments, legal instruments, to legitimize their own rule. For now, for today, but also for the future of autocratic consolidation. Autocratic consolidation. So I like to talk about one particular thing. I like us to think about it together, about those laws which were introduced almost everywhere under the umbrella, under the state of exception, whether there was a state of emergency, as it was called in Georgia and in Hungary, approved by the parliament immediately, the state of epidemic in Poland, which Polish government did not resort to announcing the state of emergency. State of epidemic does not exist in the Polish law, in fact. It is a footnote to the footnote in the constitution. Or the other acts, such as Authorization Act that, as Andras wrote, gave Orban unlimited power. But I would like us to look at especially at the state of emergency, on the kind of a family of concepts and practices in various places having to do with the imposition of the state of emergency under the because of the pandemic. Could this borderless event, the pandemic, be hijacked to benefit the consolidation of autocratic legalism, or might it be, under certain conditions, might it serve, just passively serve, to topple it? So I like our colleague from Georgia to start, And again, if you can focus on that, everything else is welcome, because details give us a sense of the texture, larger social texture, socio-political texture, which will help us understand the Georgian case. But here you are, Malkhaz.
Thank you for. It's my pleasure to talk with you. So far we had very interesting cases to discuss, and I also would like to kind of present what's going on in Georgia in this term. Our panel is called as how the responses to the pandemic strengthening authoritarian movements. So I would like to look at in Georgian case from different perspective. I think that pandemic maybe weaken authoritarian kind of motivations or movements or kind of attempts of the government, and I would like to, of course, kind of provide it in a basic elements why I think so. But I would like to start with kind of anecdotal issue. So responding to Slovakia's case about, we also have flying bishops with icons and like a blessing from heaven, Georgia, and against the coronavirus. But of course, not because of that, that Georgia, fortunately, stands out as a kind of a good place in terms of dealing with the pandemic. So far, there's a maximum 700 cases, 12 people died, and we have these relations of percentages. They are more recovered than.
How many people live in Georgia, Malkhaz?
It's around 4 million, 0.5, you know. Neighboring Armenia, they have really dramatic developments. Unfortunately, past 2 days, they have this spike of pandemic. So I think this, of course, and government, and I would like to turn to this, issue of our conversation today. The government also gives credits to itself, and this stop epidemiologists constantly thanking government about this, you know, how they deal with this problem. But there's of course questions, you know, what are the real structural problems, for instance? Why state of emergency is introduced if not all parts of society are obliged to follow the rules? And this is kind of naked problem now, and not only for a few, but in the liberal part of the society, the progressive part of society, and this in general audience also somehow are concerned with this issue that the church, which is a powerful institution traditionally, especially after the post-Soviet context, when Soviet Union was dissolved, the church took the role of the nation and kind of started providing or strengthening or propagating ethno-religious identity and, you know, hijacking the idea of nationalism generally. And that's why there's a tradition of playing of power relations, like a state-church relations, and all administrations since the dissolution of Soviet Union try to kind of balance a relationship with the church, because they are good source of, in terms of electoral kind of capital, they can mobilize part of society, and, you know, then government could win, for instance, the election. So now, when state of emergency was introduced, the church was sort of, you know, was defying these rules, and they quite demonstratively held these Easter services throughout the country. Of course, they sort of follow generally the rules, but, you know, many people think that this was a clear manifestation of capitulation of the state.
So it was a state of exception with the exception of the church.
Yes, yes, and then therefore that it does not make sense if myself, for instance, and my family and many other hundreds, thousands of people were sitting at home like almost 2 months, and suddenly people are gathering in church and undermining these all measures, which is necessary in terms of physical distance, and we all know about this. But what's important here, the government is trying to use church support in order to gain political kind of advantages. There's upcoming elections in Georgia, and they desperately need some kind of support. And they are starting already kind of, in 2 days, the state of emergency will be lifted, but today there's another initiative which would give legal initiative, I would like to stress on that, which would give government the right without any further procedural kind of steps, like in parliament or etc., impose restrictions again if it is necessary. So
we have to finish here, Malkhaz.
Yeah.
You can join in because we are already late. We are below the thing, but thank you so much.
But I would like to, if I may, just a couple of words, I would like to conclude with hopes that, unlike Hungary, for instance, the government is not so strong. So, for instance, government was forced to release 2 major leaders of opposition party from jail yesterday. And the opposition parties are gathering and they are steadily losing influence. And another anecdotal conclusion from me, that even though there is no church cluster, so-called church cluster, because we have this couple of priests already infected, but government is denying of existence of this sort of church cluster, the church also is not perceived as seriously as they were perceived like a couple of years ago. So I think we don't have backslide to the self-democracy, but I hope that there would be opening for democratic processes. But that's my hope.
Thank you. Thank you. Finally, what I'd like us to talk briefly, actually, I would like to invite Alexandra to talk about it, or to start a conversation about it, is that kind of well, I like to call it, mostly because I've written about it some year ago or so, about that strange situation in which democracy is being undermined by, in which democracy is framed as conspiracy, and therefore, under the situation of the virus, we found ourselves in various places seeing the mainstreaming of conspiracy. In the situation of social distancing, isolation, loneliness, the separate virus, completely separate virus, was launched. We call it in America infodemic, which spreads the fake news, and it's a lot of that everywhere, by the far right and by the all under the COVID umbrella. The case of Slovakia is interesting and it's different. You are writing there about that kind of Schmittian political principle, although I think I'm adding it to you, but you are talking about the friend versus enemy narrative that targets refugees and so on, and that it is actually losing power, that it's losing its explanatory as it usually it is. The conspiracies are to explain to people who otherwise don't know or are uncertain. So is the situation of a pandemic indeed an opportunity for the rebuilding the cross-national bonds of solidarity, as you suggest? And what are the other ways? Because there is this threat, that certain things that opened that path to a formal, larger, what I called earlier mainstreaming of conspiratorial theories. So, if you can tell us what you've written about it and how that might relate to my concerns, which may not be necessarily your concerns.
Okay, Elzbieta, thank you very much. It's you opened a huge area, which I really cannot
talk about
everything. Yes, and I also must admit that I was inspired by so many things already, which I would like to comment, but I can't. Yeah. No, we can't be here another hour. So my paper was really focused on a slightly different or mainly specific angle within the pandemic. And I will also, as you did, start with a personal story shortly, that in 2013, November 2013, me living in a central Slovak city of Banska Bystrica, me and all our citizens, we woke up to election results which no one expected. No one expected, no political analysts, no one. Our regional governor in the city and region where I live, one of 8 in Slovakia, in legitimate elections, the fascist was elected as a regional governor. This was the first official entering of fascists, or you can call it neo-Nazis, but fascists in official Slovak politics. They tried since 2003, and they had one political party which was then legally banned, but they established a new one and were more careful. I'm not going to all details because I know that we are talking about democracy and pandemic, so I just want to describe, and also wanted to describe this in a context in my paper. So after this happened, this terrible shock and despair for many people, that for the first time we had a real fascist who denied the Holocaust, who were completely against all immigrants, against the Roma minorities, openly denying all things which are anti-democratic, of course, against the EU, against the NATO, against the Americans, and pro-Russian, and it's just to mention a few of their values, so-called. So the country was absolutely in the shock, and the same were we in the region where I live. That's why, to make it shorter, that's why some of us, some people, a few people from academia, but mainly the people from NGOs, got together immediately the night after it happened, and we started to discuss that we cannot allow this to happen again, because this is
Alexandra, let's fast forward 7 years. Because I'm looking for this optimism in your paper.
And the reason what happened was that our main approach of this, not in our town movement, which was inspired by the US movement, against extremism, against racism, anti-Semitism, and blah, blah. Yes, we established the movement, and our main goal was that in the next election, we have to mobilize the people to get rid of the fascists, and we have to mobilize the people to vote for a democratic candidate. We did a lot of things, okay, and we managed. But in the meanwhile, unfortunately, the party of this fascist, whose name is Marian Kotleba, got in power or got more and more supporters, and they got into the national parliament in 2016. And although they were in the opposition, they really had quite a strong impact on all kinds of things. Not that they did any big things in the politics, but they really managed to attract a lot of people, voters, and a lot of young voters, which was interesting, young voters between 18 to 28. And
how does the pandemic helps the movement?
Yes.
Or how does the pandemic?
That's how it. As Samuel and Michal already mentioned, we had elections on 29th of February this year, which was the result was interesting, but the predictions before the elections and pre-election opinion polls were quite frightening, because they showed that this Kotleba fascist party will get about 12 to 14%, and there was even the possibility that they could become a leading party with other coalition with other parties. Which was really, these elections were for Slovakia the very important elections, whether Slovakia will go towards democracy or against democracy. In the end, in the elections, surprisingly, this fascist party got not predicted 12 to 14%, but only 7.9%. So after the elections, which already, as we heard, it was only 1 week before, between the election and the start of lockdown and the pandemic. It was only 1 week. So this political party, this fascist party, really became, in first 2, 3, 4 weeks maybe, slightly paralyzed, we could say. We couldn't hear very much of them, but soon, of course, similarly to other right-wing parties like in Germany or Italy, they started to develop their narratives that corona pandemic is, of course, the result of mass immigration to Europe. They blamed the same, this party and the German party.
And do
Italian,
people hear them? Do people listen to them? Alexandra, do they have a larger public that listens to them?
Yes, they are excellent on social media, excellent in social media and in fake news and all these things. And they, of course, support each other within also Europe with the Hungarian, Italian, German, all these conspiracy theories that the virus was brought to our countries because of immigration, because the open borders and all these things. So it all led then into some rhetorics that, yes, after now we have the borders closed, it should stay closed because we can see that that's a good thing. Another point is that after this didn't work so well in the Slovak context, that all immigrants brought, we have no immigrants here, so it couldn't work very well in their rhetorics. So they started to go in another way, and this Kotleba, the leader of the party, he introduced a new theory and video, which was really shared among the country by thousands of people, that the pandemic is part just of a greater plan of some secret powers who want to control the lives of citizens, and who will use the vaccination to inject nanochips in people, and we will be all controlled then when we are vaccinated. So this anti-vax
we need to finish with you. Go ahead. One more sentence.
This one anti-vax movement is another new narrative which these extremist parties, not only in Slovakia, of course, also in other countries, use in order to also connect it, not only to tell people that this is bad, but to connect it as this is bad because it is either a plot of some greater powers or it's a China's virus, or even it's a Jewish plot to control the world. So there are all kinds of narratives why future vaccination will be a bad thing and you cannot follow it. And if I can make just one point, I know that I speak too much, but the next point and next stage is increasingly important and also frightening, because in all analysis of economic crisis, which of course pandemic will be followed by a huge economic crisis in many countries, in all analysis of this economic crisis, it's obvious that it's the fertile area for extremists. And there is a very interesting study, and I will finish with this, of 2015, which was done by the Center for Economic Policy Research, which is an European organization based in the UK, which they really analyzed all big economic crises since 1860 something until 2014, and really they said that in 20 advanced economies and more than 800 elections, and they said that the key finding is, and I will now read it, that policy, economy, and economic uncertainty rises strongly after all these financial crises, and voters seem to be particularly attracted to the political rhetoric of the extreme right, which often attributes blame to minorities and foreigners. And on average,
I think we
far-right parties increase their vote share by 30% after each economic crisis. And
yeah, our problem now is that it's much more than economic crisis, and our space is shrinking because there's a space for movement. So I'd like to ask, now we don't have much time. I'm sorry that I'm being so sharp, but I just have to. I wanted to ask a larger question, looking at those at the parts of the discussion that you just guys heard, in which I think at least in two cases, there is an indication that pandemic might be actually weakening or serves as an opportunity for the rebuilding of a sense of agency on the part of citizens, and a kind of perhaps new bonds of social solidarity, and there is of course this other element, and I like us to bring in the unfinished discussion from the last session, and there is this last thing that space is shrinking. The social distancing is actually making it less possible for us to achieve those goals that we are looking for of re-democratization. So. I don't.
Open.
Floor is open. I actually lost the vision, but I think I had it here. So please join this discussion, which was trying to look at the situation in which the economic tools are being used to de-democratize the situation at the legal tools, especially the case of the situation of emergency, but also the mainstreaming of enlarging the space in which the presence of voices that Alexandra was talking about is much more visible and reaches more bigger audience. Marie, I might not have it from the very beginning, everybody from the very beginning. Let me just start with Maria. She was the last one, but I will go back to the prior. Maria Bucor. Or Bucor.
Yes, hi everybody. Hi. This has been fascinating. I just I want to ask, because this discussion about sort of this potential democratic opening or opposition to authoritarianism sounds really good in principle, but the thing that I keep coming back to is that at this point, expertise in some really specific components of not just governance, but very specific policy making having to do with healthcare, first and foremost, right, is absolutely necessary at the center of any kind of decision-making power, right? And so I think that we need to think through that as well. You know, there's no guarantee that doctors are to be somehow all of a sudden, just because they understand the crisis better than we do, you know, have a kind of desire to work against fascists or against authoritarian regimes. There's nothing out there that says this is a necessary connection, right? And so at the same time, I realized that we absolutely depend on that kind of expertise, right? That we're in essence vulnerable to science. I mean, I'd like to be vulnerable to science. That's better than being vulnerable to, you know, irrationality or theology or whatever. But at the same time, I think that any kind of discussion of post-COVID, you know, long-term policymaking really needs to take into consideration this need for technocrats, because that's what I'm going to call them, to come in and play a role. When I had this conversation with my friend, Jeff will know who I'm talking about, Mihaela, she said that that was a really bad idea. Okay, I'm not a political science, but she as a political science push back against this notion of, you know, technocracy is going to save us from autocrats. In her view, and I, you know, she's not here to defend herself, but like in her view, the technocrats were the other side of populists, in the sense that there's a kind of a sense of unaccountable power that ends up being accumulated in the hands of those people, right? But at the same time, I don't know how practically one can really just talk about what we're talking about without really dealing with this issue of expertise, right? So I wonder what people think about that.
What if this expertise is being undermined? What if this expertise is being questioned? What if this expertise is being neglected or marginalized, and people who do know facts and numbers and reasons, and they do research, health research, are not actually given the voice?
So what you're talking about is actually the idea of kind of the knowledge being manipulated by political actors in some way that is not transparent, right? So that's part of the kind of trying to
in the United States, right? This is part of our experience. Of course, we kind of know, but we are not to know because we are being fed. If we want to believe what the government said, we are being fed according to the experts and the facts which are based on lies.
I'm also right. I mean, and I wonder for like the smaller states that are being represented in the case studies, like Georgia, right? I mean, I don't know, honestly. I just do not know what the level of expertise inside of the country, you know, where like there's research being done, there on the current problems happening there, right? How that is shaping up in a relationship with the policymakers. Because yes, in the United States, our problem is at the federal level, obviously CDC says one thing. This just happened today, right? The president said something else. Okay, which means most of us are not listening to what the feds are saying. We're reading Harvard studies and University of Minnesota studies. But we have knowledge-making power that is extraordinary in this country. And that's in a way maybe our hope. I wonder in smaller countries where you don't have, you know, the kind of hands-on research being done right there, right then, and capacity. Somebody was talking about capacity building earlier, right? If you don't have that, you depend on other states, which opens up the issue of this kind of accusation that science becomes the handmaiden of some crazy globalist American plot, for instance. I mean, that's one way to kind of manipulate it.
Let me just tell you who is in line, and I will ask people who think that they have direct response to what you've just raised, speak first. So it's Elzbieta Korolczuk, Jeff has a comment, and there are voices, and there's Utku about technocracy versus autocracy. Yeah, and there is Renata. Who would like to speak? Maybe I will ask Jeff for comment, and then we'll go to Elzbieta if you don't want to if you want to intervene in the meantime.
I would respond to what Maria just said about authoritarianism versus technocracy versus democracy, and I think that one thing that we should keep in mind that not technocracy but medicine and science are dialogic and not monologic, and they're dialogic as internal communities, ideally, and also as they then present alternatives to political actors. So the struggle has to be a struggle for the dialogic, scientific, technical project in interaction with democracy. It's not a substitute for, but it's a significant extension of the democratic process, and it does challenge autocracy. That process does challenge autocracy.
Elzbieta?
I want to talk about other things, but I think it's really interesting what Maria said about knowledge. And I think that we very seldom talk about politics of knowledge in terms of, you know, how not only how knowledge is produced, but also how it's used, whether it is integrated within the political processes, how it is integrated, who is seen as the legitimate speaker or the producer of knowledge, who are the brokers, who are the consumers, so to speak, in this. It's just as one of the models, but that's the one that is probably most popular. I think that there are two things to think about. One is the process of legitimization, and because I'm working in Sweden and in Poland, and I've been looking at the process of legitimization of knowledge in gender equality politics and in neuroproductive technologies field. There is a huge difference in the ways in which those processes are developing. In Poland, you basically have, and I think it's in quite many countries, you have the political will, and then you have the process in which people who have certain attachment to power circles can sort of chip in with their knowledge, right? In Sweden, it is much more about legitimization through the position of people who produce it, but also the idea that political decisions should be separated from, let's say, knowledge base. And, you know, we see very serious and real differences in the response to COVID-18, which are very much rooted in the politics of knowledge, so to speak. And I think that we should see, and I see it very much in the field of these anti-gender mobilizations, ultra-conservative mobilizations, the ways in which the language that has been produced by progressive movements, like the language of rights, the language of minority rights, the language of vulnerability, has been very much used and hijacked and taken over by ultra-conservative groups and right-wing populists. So they don't talk about morality so much anymore, although it is very much politics of morality. They talk about the minority rights of unborn children, for example. And in that sense, it's a huge challenge for all of us, how to deal with the language of human rights, which we produce as a, not necessarily in this group, although I think also, but as a group, as a political formation, so to speak, and as a group of intellectuals, and what to do with the situation where those key concepts are being used in a way which has very different normative sort of insight. And I think one of the ways which comes out from my research on feminist mobilizations is to ground those propositions in both the emotional field and also the sort of embodied experience of actual people, and sort of to bring the actual embodied experience into the abstract discussions. So I will stop here, but I think that this is a really...
This is where you're kind of bringing the discussion from the last session together, when we were trying to figure out how to actually translate or transform the power and the knowledge of civic experience, citizens' experience in the local level, to the more abstract level, which could impact the governance on the central level, which is important. Malkhaz, you wanted to explain how the knowledge is produced in the small countries.
Yeah, thank you.
How dependent you are.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So it directly refers to the democracy situation. In terms of knowledge generating situation, we should consider it at different levels. There is a state, of course, with its top epidemiologists, for instance, providing updates every day. But there are also quite strong think tanks, organizations, which provide quite qualified commentaries about ongoing issues, not only about health, but also how might government using these technologies of power in order to abuse the pandemic situation. And there's third level, experts or doctors working outside of Georgia, like in US, in Europe, in top universities or organizations. And what is more important, these channels are open and society has the possibility to listen. So I think despite the size of small, there is a kind of qualitatively alternative ways of learning what's going on in country. Yeah.
Intellectual or academic remittances, that's interesting. The connection with diaspora and with people engaged abroad and the channels back, which has to do with the expertise on health, but also about the experiences of democracy. I think it's 2:30. I don't think we've finished this conversation. I hope that we will be able to return back to the issues of social conditions under the pandemic, and especially the situation of bigger social divisions and economic divisions between lack of inequality on that level tomorrow. And perhaps we will be able to bring together again, to return to the question on how to translate the local to the central, or how to impact the policies or actually change the politics